A line is perhaps the most underestimated tool that an artist has. The thinnest of objects, it has a very small amount of width that has almost no depth. It has no three-dimensionality at all. And yet with this line, we can bring worlds into life. We can draw things that look as though you could walk into them. We can draw things that look as if you could run your fingers over them and feel the shapes and the textures. We can transform a two-dimensional piece of paper into a scene that looks like it goes miles and miles into the distance. We can create a distinction between the linear, hard shapes of architecture and the organic growth and shape of a tree. With lines, we can show shade and shadow. And we can create a scene that draws us into it and engages our imagination. So in this video, we're looking at the line and we're considering all the different ways we can draw it and we can use it to create and enhance the subject we're trying to draw. Let's go. So we're going to start with looking at straight lines. There'll be some very practical tips for when you're actually doing line work in your drawings scattered through this. There are two ways we can draw straight lines. We can use a ruler or not. And they each have their own characteristics. And in some ways, this choice, whether we use a ruler or not for our straight lines, I think is one of the strongest influences of how our drawing will look at the end. Using a ruler gives it a far more architectural drafting feel, a more technical look. Freehand drawing all of our lines will give it a slightly more relaxed look, more of an illustrative feel. While one is not superior to the other, I think every artist who draws needs to make a choice, because very rarely do I see them combine well. If we choose to use a ruler, it's quite straightforward. But if we choose to draw freehand, then straight lines present some challenges. So here are some tips on drawing straight lines freehand. Firstly, don't draw them with the fingers and don't draw them with the wrists. Use the whole arm. Keep our wrist and fingers locked in position and move the whole arm at least from the elbow, if not from the shoulder. That gives us a lot more stability with our line. Second tip before we draw a line is to know where the line's going before we start drawing it. And so we might usually have a starting point that might connect with something we've already drawn. There may be another line that we have to connect, or it may be that we're breaking into new territory. If there's no mark on the paper for where this line is going to go, I like to put one because it helps me focus. So let's say we're taking this straight line over to here. The next thing I usually do is a dress rehearsal. I give my arm experience at moving the end of the pen to where I want it to go. If you like, I create a memory in my arm of what I'm going to ask it to do next. And then I need to not look at the end of my pen, I need to look at where I want the pen to go. I keep that my focus and I intuitively bring my arm to that point. And that's not too bad. Now, if it's a long line that I'm drawing, then I might make a break halfway through. I may want to put a dot part of the way across just to help guide me. If I stop, when I go to rejoin my line, I find a very helpful thing is not to join on the line, but to join right next to it. Because if I join on the line, I overlap. And unless I get it exactly right, it becomes more obvious than having the very slightest of gaps between the two lines. This is a really helpful tip that I learned early in my drawing. I adopted it straight away and I use it every time I draw. Another really helpful thing with lines is to know which directions you can draw straight lines most accurately, most easily. For some people, a horizontal line might flow more easily than a vertical line. And then with diagonal lines, it might be that one direction flows more easily than the other direction. So it's helpful to know what works for us, because when I draw, I can rotate my paper so that if my most accurate and easiest line is left to right horizontally, I can make every line a left to right horizontal line, regardless of which direction it goes in the finished drawing. I've noticed that I can draw vertical lines accurately horizontally if they're not too long, but it's harder to be accurate the longer they get. So I will usually draw these lines vertically, but I will move my paper or I will change the position of my body so that I draw these lines horizontally. So pay attention when you draw and work out what your favoured direction of drawing lines is. But of course, there are other types of lines besides continuous lines. There are broken lines, and there are broken lines irregularly broken. And sometimes in our drawing, we can be too hasty to draw a continuous line, when perhaps a broken line would better suit the effect we're trying to achieve. So for instance, we can look at a tree canopy from a distance, and the silhouette of that tree is a continuous line. And yet it may create a better effect if we draw that line with a lighter broken touch. And we can see that in this ink line drawing of a tree canopy. It's choosing to use a light broken touch as I did the outside edge of the tree. Some of the marks are literally just spots and dots. And for my subject and for the texture I'm trying to represent, it works. I do have videos on drawing trees if you're interested in that. But broken lines don't just have to be on trees. Sometimes a broken line can be an effective way to represent the effect of an object that's sitting on the ground. It represents the fact that the surface is not smooth that the object sits on, and therefore we don't get a completely straight edge. And if we want, we can also use the brokenness of our line to suggest foreshortening, to give a sense of visual compression the further away from the viewer we go. This can be really effective with buildings and where they connect with the ground. We can be all too quick to put a straight line in here and a straight line in there, which doesn't actually then represent what we're seeing in life. And here's a recent example from another video where, although I did have a light guideline, I drew my line over the top with a lot of breaks to suggest the gravelly surface that this building sat on. Now, of course, we also have curved lines. And very often in drawing buildings and architecture, our curves actually follow circular or half-circle shapes. And so it's often easier visually to break our curves down into squares, to divide our squares into quarters so that we're not drawing a whole circle at once, but we're drawing a quarter. And if we have an easier direction to draw circles in, we can turn our paper, as we looked at in the last section, so that each of those curves is in our sweet spot for drawing. Often though, we're only drawing half circles. We're drawing domes or we're drawing arches, and so it works the same way. I might just have two sides of a window and I need the arch to sit on top. Even so then, I visualize the boxes, I visualize the two equal squares, and it can be helpful to put a point midway where I want my arch to go. And just a tip in drawing arches such as this, make sure that the arch comes up in a nice almost straight line. It can be easy to curve too quickly and to create a much more shallow effect on our arch than there is in real life. I can also use line to create shade and shadow, or even just for local colour. And I can do that by hatching, drawing lots of lines close together. If I just draw them in one direction, it's called hatching. And if I do it in two different directions, it's called cross-hatching. One of the difficulties with hatching is to be accurate where we start and finish. So it can be helpful to come from both directions. But what we need to avoid doing is scribbling. Because rather than doing individual lines, we're whipping back and forth to create the maximum lines in the minimum time, and our accuracy starts to disappear. Another choice we get to make with lines is the weight of our lines. I can draw a line pressing heavy and hard and going relatively slowly, and that creates a certain effect. However, I can do the lines quicker with a lighter touch, or quicker with a lighter touch, or quicker with a lighter touch. And the question is, do these squares look as if they're all on the same plane? Or do some of them look as though they're a bit further away? But by making our line lighter, that also gives a sense of distance because things further away aren't as clear. I can do it just by varying the pressure, or I can physically change pens from a 0.5mm nib to a 0.3mm nib to a 0.2mm nib to a 0.1mm nib, and so on, to help me create that same effect of objects receding in a distance. The weight of my line is a very powerful tool in creating an effect in a drawing, but we can choose to vary the weight of lines in the very same line. If I'm wanting to indicate some shade on a cylinder, I might choose to start with a darker, heavier, pressing down more line, but to lift the line as it proceeds across the surface of the can to get a lighter, thinner effect, to create a more feathery look, a more diffuse line down the edge of the shadow. And so varying the thickness of my line within a line is also a technique or a tool that I have. We're wanting to create a wall of windows, 4 windows across by 4 windows down, that all line up vertically and horizontally. And in life, they're perfectly aligned. So we want to get our drawing as accurately as possible. I find the order in which I draw my lines makes a huge difference as to how accurately I'm able to line these up. So in most cases, because the vertical lines are longer, I do those first. I'll show you how they look when I don't use my usual technique. But what I've learnt to do is to draw my lines in a certain order. Most of the time, what works best for what I'm drawing is this. I firstly draw the vertical lines, and I make sure I align them one after the other, and by doing them in virtually one continuous line, just lifting the pen off, it's the easiest way to get them aligned under each other. So now I put my horizontal lines in, and now my focus is a nice straight horizontal line. As I put the line where it needs to be, I don't worry about where my vertical lines begin or end. This works just as well if, say, there were decorative columns there. And if I've got window details such as struts for supporting window panes, I also do those the same way. I go in all one direction down, and then I go across. So the order in which we draw our lines can make it much easier to get an accurate result if we do it one way as opposed to doing it another way.